So I was looking at the importance of environmental justice from a biblical standpoint. The more I read and the more I discovered that the issues and impact of climate change on poor communities and people of color is deeply related to a pervasive lack of environmental justice. Environmental justice realizes the intersectionality of how we take care of creation. Our understanding of creation must become more expansive as we study these various intersectionalities, because creation is not just environmentalism, and environmental justice is not just how we take care of the environment, but also how we take care of one another through environmental justice. So I want to get started with two definitions of environmental justice that we have. The first one comes from the Environmental Protection Agency, and it says environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Now, there's a lot that's good with this definition from my standpoint, but there's also some things that are lacking. So the first thing that we see that's a pro is that it shows the understanding that policy and regulation are connected to environmental justice issues and are also a part of the solution. They're not the whole solution, but they are a part of the solution, because in many way, shape, and form, they are a part of the problem. That much of the issues that we see with how environmental injustice affects people of color and poorer communities is deeply rooted in the regulations and the legislation and the policies that we oftentimes see that position profits over people. But there is a con to this definition. And that is in the fact that justice is not just about fair treatment, but it is also about right relationship and connectivity. A more detailed description of environmental justice is given by the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit held in Washington, D.C. in 1991. This meeting developed 17 principles of environmental justice that are deeply significant and important as it relates to our discussion and dialogue tonight. Due to that significance, we have shared them in their entirety, right? Now, what I will do is I will give I have already sent the PowerPoint presentation to Lori. So those that want the PowerPoint presentation, you can have it. So that way I don't have to read everything on the PowerPoint presentation. So we see here this preamble that they have that talks about the fact that environmental justice is not just how we treat the world, but also how we treat one another. And so they go with environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth. Environmental justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice from all people, for all people. Environmental justice mandates the right to ethical, balanced, and responsible uses of land and renewable resources in the interest of a sustainable planet. That environmental justice calls for universal protection from nuclear testing, extraction, production, and disposal of toxic and hazardous waste. That environmental justice affirms the fundamental right to political, economic, cultural, and environmental self-determination for all peoples. It talks about environmental justice demanding the cessation of the production of all toxins, hazardous waste, and radioactive materials. If you skip to 8, environmental justice affirms the right of all workers to a safe and healthy work environment without being forced to choose between an unsafe livelihood and unemployment. Environmental justice protects the rights of victims of environmental injustice to receive full compensation and reparations for damages. Environmental justice also in number 11, skipping across, deals with recognizing special legal and natural relationship of Native peoples to the land. Environmental justice also affirms the need for urban and rural ecological policies to clean up cities and rural areas with a balance to nature. Environmental justice opposes the destructive operations of multinational corporations. And environmental justice requires that we as individuals make personal and consumer choices to consume less than necessary. Um, all of these two definitions are great definitions. And these principles, these 17 principles that we saw and we touched on briefly in the interest of time, are much better definitions and descriptions of environmental justice than the EPA one from my position, because it takes into account that environmental justice must not include just what we do to the earth, but also what we do to one another. Environmental evil does more than exploit the environment, but it also exploits the whole of creation, and that includes humanity. These principles also present a deep analysis of the truth that breaches of environmental justice are often linked with other unjust actions and are revealed in other areas of disparity, such as race and class. It is also the perspective of the presenter, of myself, that environmental justice in principle can also be discerned from the Christian scriptures. It can be discerned from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. And we can see a scriptural environmental justice principles can find their roots in Genesis 1 and 28, which reads, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Now, often this scripture has been interpreted in ways that allow for the exploitation of the created order in almost every category. These interpretations ignore, however, the implied stewardship within the delegated dominion that is given by God. It is very clear that the dominion that God gives humanity in this scripture is not simply inherent in humanity. We don't get it because of who we are, but it is given by God as an act of blessing and grace. We are graced to be stewards of creation, and this includes stewards regarding one another. This is rooted in the scriptural principle that we are created, formed, and shaped in the image of God. Reverend Brent said it best in his book, Cathedral on Fire, when he writes, God is in the business of creating a world of harmonious order and goodness. As a majestic and divine gardener, God is bringing life into existence. So when God declares that humans are made in the image of God, we are carrying, that's the image, this is the image we are carrying. We are gardeners seeking to cultivate and sustain a harmonious creation. This suggests the assumption of responsibility. This verse details God's intended purpose for humanity, but that we have to ask the question, how does this verse relate to the dominion that has been delegated in regards to environmental justice? Because oftentimes that's where we drop the ball with regards to the environment. We assume that because we have this delegated dominion, that humanity can do whatever it wants to God's creation. Now, biblically, justice is deeply connected to an understanding of a right and appropriate relationship rooted in God's view of creation and creation's purpose. So biblical environmental justice is to look to look at the blessing that God gave all of humanity, to look at and see if that blessing is made possible by our policies, decisions, and governmental regulations. Biblical environmental justice, then, is to submit our exploitative wants and actions to the blessing that God has given to all humanity. Now, as we look at Genesis 1 and 8, we see that these words are not simply a command, but words of blessing that should regulate our interactions, concerns, and expectations. Now, according to Genesis 1:28, God gives several components to the basic blessing that really sets the stage for not just the biblical story in its entirety, but also the wrestling of the church with regards to caring for the creation that we've been entrusted to. These components are: one, fruitfulness, multiplication, filling of the earth, ruling in the distinct areas of creation, sea, land, and air. Now, each of these components is given to all humans, both personally and collectively. But these are not just for the sake of ruling, but for the sake of stewarding what God has already created as a part of the human community. These are not given to us for individual enrichment or for private profit, but for personal and collective responsibility for the whole. Now, one can make the argument that any action, right, regarding the environment that hinders the fruitfulness, expansion, and progression that takes into account all of the creatures of the earth, including our fellow humans, is in violation of this blessing. Notice, however, that this blessing also does not mean that creation belongs to us. I cannot say that, and I cannot stress that enough, that creation does not belong to us, but that we are stewards of what belongs to God. Nowhere in this text does God state that creation has ceased to belong to God. Instead, we are invited to participate in the regency of creation as God's image bearers and image bearing partners, right, in the unfolding drama of God's loving interaction with a creation that is repeatedly declared good. See, creation is not ours to do with what we want. Creation is the handiwork of God, and its operation and interworking presents the power, glory, intentionality, and love of God. We see this in Psalms 119, 1 and 6, and in Psalm 74, 12 through 17. These Psalms present to us the spiritual principle that the creation we see and the creation that we are a part of declares to those who are willing to listen and see the glory of God. It has been entrusted to us to continue the process of creation and the complex diversity as partners with God that remain in a state of awe and wonder as the beauty of creation and its continued unfolding. As we see how we and connect creation, the larger creation, are interconnected, because we see that we get a taste of that creation that is implanted within us, as we see in Ecclesiastes 3 and 11. We see this throughout Scripture, however, even in the miracles of the Lord, right? In the miracles, we see Jesus not simply have rulership over creation, but that the agency of creation is brought to bear for the healing and wholeness of others. The miracles of Jesus that are done through the use of and the subduing of creation are done not for exploitation, but for the wholeness of the other. Some of the miracles of Jesus and their environmental justice implications are as follows. Mark 4, 35 and 41, where we have the stilling of the sea, that presents the Lord who has authority over sea and wind, not for show, but for the preservation of life. Matthew 14, 13 and 21, with the feeding of the 5,000, presents to us that as stewards of creation, we must move in such a way that the bounty of land and sea will feed more than just ourselves. Matthew 17, verses 1 through 8, the transfiguration shows the glory of the Lord that will be on display when we are willing to see that delegated dominion does not excuse us from obedience to God's primordial purpose for creation. And then the resurrection story in all of the Gospels shows that God is definitively against the exploitive and violent actions of humanity that produce death and destruction. Based upon these and other various scriptures, such as Deuteronomy 20 and 19, that provides a stipulation against the willful destruction of fruit trees during siege warfare, we can discern that the scriptures present to us a God who is concerned for justice and right relationship regarding the whole of creation. In fact, one can express that to have a sense of biblical environmental justice is to provide care and love for every part of the created order, right? So to that end, based upon the scriptures that we have presented, let's work with let's present a working definition of biblical environmental justice. This working definition of biblical environmental justice is this: that biblical environmental justice is the righteous engagement of the various aspects of creation, including humanity, for the purpose of stewarding its well-being, appreciating its complexity, and lovingly striving for, sorry for that typo, for the eradication of systemic exploitation, oppression, and mistreatment of the created order through personal and collective action. This is key to the definition, as an act of worship toward the God who, according to the scriptures, creation glorifies. As expressed previously, creation reveals and declares the divine glory. But the caveat is that we must be willing to listen to the song of creation. And there are some things that hinder our ability to listen to the majesty of God revealed in the interlacing and interconnectivity of creation, ourselves included. What is the primary thing that hinders our ability to hear and see the song of glory that is creation? Uh, sin. Sin, as I define it here for the presentation, sin is the violation and transgression of the will of God. And according to Genesis 1:28, God's will for creation and God's will for the whole of creation is to be fruitful, to multiply, and to exercise stewardship through delegated dominion. So what we see here is that anytime we are unwilling to operate from a position of environmental justice, we are in sin. Now, how is this sin expressed? And I'll show you just right when I can present it. How is this sin expressed? Oh, here we go. How is this sin expressed in regards to environmental justice? The first is environmental racism, which is the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. What are some of these examples of environmental racism? Redlining, basically stating through the means of real estate, HUD, lending programs, that certain people cannot live in certain places. Food deserts are another example of environmental racism, because there is not access to adequate and healthy food supply. Gentrification is another example of environmental racism. Urban sprawl is another example. And already access to drugs and alcohol and police brutality and murder. Because oftentimes in those areas where we have these issues and these disparities, we have and we have the possibility of crime, we have a larger police presence. And because of that larger police presence, there is more opportunity for police brutality and even murder by police. There's another way that this is seen as sin in environmental classism, where environmental issues that are connected and rooted in economic and income disparity. Once again, we see urban renewal, urban sprawl, close proximity to industrial areas to live because of the cheapness of land, ready access to drugs and alcohol, and also police brutality and murder. And I hope people have noticed that some of these things have the same in each category. I hope people have noticed that, right? Because both of these are sin, and both of these violate the blessing and commandment of God, because they are rooted in the enactment of policies, social protocols, regulations, and legislation that use race, ethnicity, and the personal or collective placement upon the spectrum between abundance and poverty as technologies of power to regulate those that the positions of truth in a certain society deem undesirable. And it cannot be lost on us that these two issues tend to go hand in hand. They can show the effects of racism and poverty upon the same population, especially with regards to environmental justice, since in much of American history, environmental racism has gone hand in hand with deplorable living conditions and poverty. Both of these issues are affected by both practice and policy. It is not just that folk find themselves in places where pollution is rampant, but often where pollution is deemed acceptable, because that acceptability is rooted in the skin color of who lives there and how wealthy they are. Now, when we fail at environmental justice, we run the risk of climate change disproportionately affecting low income and racial communities that are already victims of white supremacy. Now, a definition of climate change from the University of California, Davis, because as we talk about this, we have to ask the question, where does climate change factor into issues of sinful environmental injustice? And in order to do that, we have to provide a definition for what climate change is. And I sought to use the definition of climate change from the University of California, Davis, where it says climate change refers to significant changes in global temperature, precipitation, wind patterns, and other measures of climate that occur over several decades or longer. But this is the thing, though. Climate change is not just about natural phenomena, but its climate change also happens because of the result of human action through both personal activity and collective social and political action that adversely affects those who already suffer from sustained economic oppression and suppression. When climate change happens because of profits and selfishness taking precedent over the purpose of stewardship rooted in restorative redemption, there is a deep problem. Climate change that comes from a sense of sinful selfishness and exploitation will adversely affect races, ethnicities, and others who were considered low income and undesirable to the larger community and society. These communities have historically suffered from both small scale and large scale human induced climate change and its effects upon the environment. Now, what are some of these global and macro climate changes, right? Global, macro, local, micro climate changes. The global macro climate changes that we see and hear about often are global warming, rising sea levels, supercharged storm systems, a widespread land erosion, fossil fuel emissions, and cultural reliance on non-renewable sources of energy. But there are some local microclimate changes that oftentimes we only hear about if they become very large or if the magnitude is so great that the national news picks up on them, but they kill people by the score every year. Some of these are dumping of hazardous materials and waste in or near communities of color. The reduction of green spaces in areas that are affected by urban sprawl and oftentimes disproportionately lived in by people of color and people who are poor. Industrial plants and treatment centers that are placed near communities of color and poor communities. Now, many of these local microclimate concerns take place because poor communities and communities of color often have little access to policymakers who engage in meaningful advocacy before these issues take place. Often due to concerns of employment and daily living, these communities are often allowed into the process at the final hour when decisions have really already been made. Also, when situations occur, these communities often have little luck in achieving legal redress due to a lack of resources, and this includes a lack of access to competent legal counsel. And these issues have also caused Black, Indigenous, and minority populations to become vulnerable to COVID-19, so that COVID-19 affects minority populations in a way that is disproportionate to white populations in our nation. Now, it would have been easy for me to talk about issues of climate change looking at places like Flint, Michigan, right? Because Flint is in the news already, right? We all know about Flint, but there are other places in our nation where environmental racism and environmental classism are present with regards to local microclimate change concerns. One is Anniston, Alabama. As a show of hands, how many have heard about Anniston, Alabama? Okay. Anniston, Alabama was a town that was poisoned by the Monsanto Company, the Olin Corporation, and the U.S. Army, that gave rise to brain damage, lower intelligence, and behavioral issues in its predominantly African American population. This has given rise to an increase in violent crime and a concentration of poverty in Anniston, Alabama. Now, what's interesting is that the Environmental Protection Agency and the Justice Department could not get justice for the residents of Anniston until there was a class action lawsuit brought by Johnny Cochran, who expressed there is always some study, and they'll study it to death. Even 30 years later, you find out it's bad for you when we know it's bad for you right now. Now, this Anniston, Alabama, the residents of Anniston, Alabama, that engaged in this class action lawsuit received $142 million as a settlement. But that settlement went through 18,447 plaintiffs. So the average adult received only $9,000, and the average child received only $2,000. The Dunbar community of Fort Myers, Florida. How many of us have heard about the Dunbar community of Fort Myers, Florida? Well, the city of Fort Myers, Florida, had been dumping waste and its water from its water treatment facility in lots that it purchased from residents under the auspices of building affordable housing. But because of so much of the sludge that was dumped into these pits that in this housing area, and they were dumped in pits that actually went deeper than the local water table. It seeped in the water sources and even gave the ground an orange color called by many residents the orange slide. Residents of Dunbar, however, were not told of this dumping that started in the 1960s until 2007. In 2012, testing showed that the dumping site was 5 times higher than the EPA safety levels on record. No trespassing signs, however, were placed by the city until 2017. Now, there's also Cancer Alley in Louisiana. That is an 85-mile stretch of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that is filled with oil refineries. There, the predominantly Black population is 50 times more likely to develop cancer than the average American. We have Pahokee, Florida, where the regular burning of sugarcane fields for sugarcane growth and production triggers high levels of asthma and other respiratory issues in the predominantly Black employer community. We have Cherwell, South Carolina, where the effects of pollution from the 1970s are still being felt because in the 2018 Hurricane Florence, toxic waste and toxic materials were stirred up and dumped in areas of Cherwell, South Carolina. Even Houston, Texas, where we have the Harrisburg, Manchester area that is 98% Hispanic. And each year, local oil refineries release over 484,000 pounds of toxic materials, including high concentrations of lead, into the air. And lest we think this is just a Southern problem, right? We have Vernon, California, where the X-Tide Technologies battery plant, in operation since 1922, was closed in 2015 with a history of environmental violations, including spilling battery acid on publicly used roads. The company has abandoned the necessary environmental cleanup for the majority Hispanic area. This has left taxpayers to pick up the tab for the continued cleanup operations that have already to this moment cost the state over $176 million. We have the zip code 48 217, which is the most populated, most polluted zip code in the city. This zip code is 71% Black. And there is so much pollution from the 250-acre Marathon oil tank farm that the sky has a permanent orange glare. They continue to be in operation despite over 15 federal and state violations. And then we have African American health disparities and populations with indigenous populations in Nebraska, where the indigenous population in Nebraska uh, 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 is uh, uh, let me see, is 2 times as likely to be diagnosed with diabetes and 4.6 times as likely to die from homicide because of living in these areas. The African American population in Nebraska are 2 times as likely to be diagnosed with a stroke, 4 times as likely to have a higher mortality rate due to diabetes because of a lack of access to healthy food, and 13 times as likely to die from homicide in the great state of Nebraska. In Nebraska, Hispanics are 3.7 times as likely to have no health coverage and 2 times as likely to not have a physician because of where they are living. And then there is the current 2021 winter storm emergency in Mississippi and Texas due to the winter storm that adversely affected Black, brown, and poor communities in a deeply disproportionate way. That people are still without running water. People in many ways are still dealing with the effects of having to boil water, not having safe water to drink. And this is deeply and directly related to political and economic choices by those in power within these 2 states. The deregulation of Texas's energy grid is one example that prioritized profits over people. So the intersection of climate change, environmental justice, and environmental racism and lower economic income communities require us to review practices and policies that hinder the well-being, safety, longevity, health, and access to cleaner and greener environments. So there are some things to consider, right? What should we make of this? What can we do about it as it relates to biblical environmental justice and its intersectionality with climate change and environmental racism and low income disparity? Well, the first thing is we must have an expansive understanding of environmental care and justice. We must see environmental justice and care as not just rooted in fair treatment or equity of treatment. We're not trying to spread the mess around, right? But we have to look at environmental justice from the standpoint of just, right, and righteous intentions, treatment, and outcomes that provide for the well-being and wholeness of all those that are involved. We must be more expansive in regarding the implications of our Christian discipleship as it relates to environmental care and justice. As I heard Dr. Keck express, that you can do justice without Jesus, but you can't do Jesus without justice. That as Christians, we have a responsibility that is oftentimes seen in Romans 8:19 and 22, right? That creation is a longing for the manifestation of the children of God, that we have a responsibility to care for not just simply the least of these with the providing of food, clothing, of shelter, but also providing for the least of these with regards to the environment that we all live in. We also must recognize that we did not get here by accident. Environmental justice issues do not happen by accident. People don't just luck up on living on toxic waste dumps. People just don't happen to live by waste treatment facilities. People just don't happen to live in the in the most polluted zip code in Michigan. You know what I'm saying? People that just doesn't happen. Environmental racism is an old foe, and environmental classism is just as old. The environmental racism and classism that is being experienced or has been experienced is the result of certain practices and policies that privilege on purpose some communities, be it racial or socioeconomic, over others with deep intentionality. We also must sweep around our own front door. That's a saying that I remember some of my relatives would say in the South, and it means the full expression is sweep around your own front door before you come and sweep around mine. That oftentimes we are outraged over what is happening in Flint, but are we outraged about what's happening in the city of Lincoln? Are we outraged with regards to the place matters information that we have because of the Community Health Endowment of Lincoln? Are we outraged that in just a few blocks in the city of Lincoln, your life expectancy can go from 90 years to 68 years, right? So we have to understand and recognize and intentionally seek to empower advocacy around and give critique to our own policies and practices as persons, faith traditions, and city and state officials to ensure that environmental racism and classism are not structurally supported by personal political behavior or action, right? Then we also, as churches and faith communities, must mobilize according to what Burnt states as the Jesus theory of organizing. This theory is, number one, engaging in system change, where we challenge the status quo from a place of prophetic imagination and purpose that exposes structural and environmental sin as it relates to issues of class, race, and the sacredness of creation. The third thing of the Jesus theory of organizing is we must disrupt business as usual, where we act with holy boldness and righteous audacity to unsettle the status quo regarding climate change and environmental justice. And the third is to organize to empower, where we organize so that others can be empowered to do the work with us for structural change that is rooted in personal and collective imagining, that sees environmental justice as an imperative to the health, wholeness, and well-being of all creation. So I want to end with questions. Are there any questions that anybody may have?
Pastor Combs, I want to thank you for this powerful calling out of environmental racism and classism, and a spiritually powerful description of the sin of those and climate change as well. Addie, are you going to moderate questions? And Pastor Combs, if I could start with, I'm just curious, given that you were in seminary in a very different generation than I was. Now you're deeply informed, but in seminary, were you trained about these issues of environmental racism and such?
I think that in seminary, we touched on them with regards to the sacredness of creation, but we really did not engage in the deep prophetic training that was necessary to identify these issues and then call those issues out as sin as they are. And I can't fault the seminary for that, right? Because curriculum is a consistently changing thing. Curriculum is constantly being updated. We learn from where we are, and then there are some things that you learn as you engage in prophetic ministry. You learn to develop an eye of discernment with regards to the issues and the intersectionality of all injustices, not just racial injustice, not just injustice that deal with issues of identity and sexual orientation, but also injustices that deal with the environment. Because at the end of the day, all these injustices tend to kind of converge on where we live, how we live, and the places that we are limited to in our living.
Well said. Addie, are you taking any questions?
I don't see any right now. So oh, all right. Here, it's under Kate. There you go. Go ahead.
So can I suggest, Pastor Combs, that you stop sharing your screen? And I know Will will need that anyway. So great.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Pastor Combs, this is Bruce Baker with Vine Congregational Church here in Lincoln.
Nice to meet you.
And a quick question. As I was tremendous amount of material, and I thank you for that hugely. Under the area of pollution, in that one slide of pollution, if I saw it correctly and read it correctly, you highlighted two things. One was personal activity, and I kind of have a sense of that. And then the second one was collective activity, socio-political. I kind of get that. But in parentheses, you indicated, as I read it, regulation. Are you saying or suggesting that we look at regulation as a cause of pollution, or lack of regulation is a cause of pollution?
I would say that we have to look at because I think we'd have to look at it from both aspects, because when you allow something to take place, in a sense you are giving a de facto regulation that this is permissible, even though the regulation may never be on the books, right? It's kind of like how can I say this? It's kind of like going back to the regulations of the Jim Crow South, where many of the regulations were on the books. They were de jure segregation, but there was a lot of de facto segregation, where the regulation was rooted in social norms and social behaviors that regulated the ability of people to move and operate in society. So when you have a government, or whether it be a city government, a state government, a national government, that shows a deep unconcern for people of color and persons that are poor, in the sense that they don't regularly think of how certain environmental actions are going to affect those communities, you are in a sense engaging from what I would say de facto regulation, because you are setting up a social norm as the government that those things are permissible, and those communities need not be considered and need not be valued. Does
Thank
that
you
make
very
sense,
much.
sir?
Thank you very much.
Okay, our next question in the chat is from Terry. She says, do you have specific examples of what we can practically do to alleviate these problems in Lincoln?
I'm learning that as I go along, as we talked about right before everything got started. Some of you may not know, but I just moved back to Lincoln from St. Louis in 2019. So I'm still yet learning the lay of the land. You know what I'm saying? I see certain things with now, one of the things that I think that we could do is a push for more sources of renewable energy. I think that there is a growing dependency on fossil fuels in Nebraska, that I think that that would be better served if we could use more renewable sources of energy for Nebraskans. That's one thing that I see already. Now, as I said before, I'm still learning the lay of the land. I'm still getting introduced to some of the issues. It's kind of like buying a new house. You don't know everything until probably a couple years in, right? So I'm still learning those things that we can do in Lincoln. But I do think that regardless of whatever the situations are in Lincoln, I think a strong advocacy and a stronger attempt at faith communities coming together, and even Christian faith communities coming together to provide advocacy and to let government officials know that we are watching and we are looking at these things and we're paying attention to them. I think that's something that we can do right off the bat.
Pastor Combs, we are so glad you are back in Lincoln, and I'm wondering if, with the climate action plan underway in Lincoln, and whether I wonder as a question whether we'll hold it to task enough on the racism and classism issues, and hope we can all partner in ways to address that. Addie, I believe with a last question from Ken Winston, is that?
Yes, if I could make a quick comment. I was just actually looking at, well, first of all, thank you so much, Pastor Combs, for your presentation. I really, you said a lot of things that we needed to hear. And I thought I would just look at the Lincoln Climate Action Plan, and it does talk about environmental justice. It may not address it to the point to some of the points that you raised, but it does at least address it. So I think that's very significant. And I think that I would encourage people to go look at the Lincoln Climate Action Plan. I also wanted to mention a piece of legislation that's in front of the legislature right now. It's LB 306, and this is a bill that would help people pay their utility bills, low-income people pay their utility bills, and it's currently stuck in committee. So I'd like to encourage people to contact the Health and Human Services Committee and advocate for that bill, because it would both help people pay their electric bills and help provide more money for low-income people to become more energy efficient. And so it's both environmental justice and climate justice at the same time. So just wanted to throw in that little piece of advocacy. And thank you so much for your presentation tonight.
Thank you. My gosh, really wonderful. And on behalf of Lori Benson and the Climate Action team and all the other partners that are in this, as we near the end of our time, continuing our thanks for Pastor Combs, which we can signal by that. And thank God for his ministry, but also now we'll have another song from Will, correct?
Yes. Thank you, Pastor Combs. That was very mind-opening, and I thank you for expanding my awareness tonight. So I'm gonna end things musically tonight with a song by Cat Stevens. It's called "Morning Has Broken," and it was recommended to me by Lori Benson and Ken Winston. So here we go. Morning has broken like the first morning. Blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word. Sweet the rain's new fall, sunlit from heaven, like the first dew fall on the first grass. Praise for the sweetness of the wet garden, sprung in completeness where his feet pass. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning. like the first morning, blackbird has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for them springing fresh from the word.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Well, we've got a new dynamic combo here for Lincoln, Pastor Combs and Will Hutchinson.
And I went to Lincoln High too, yeah.
And let me just say that as we close this evening, please consider joining us next week with the Norfolk Mayor, Josh Menning, talking about adopting the future of energy right now. Also, please know Pastor Combs' wonderful presentation will be up as a recording on the First-Plymouth website, and you'll be able to find that, Addie, probably by tomorrow. Would that be? Okay, by tomorrow. And so again, my friends, thank you for being in solidarity and faith and spirit this evening. May God bless you all. Go in peace. Amen.